I'm absolutely not going to let you continue sabotaging your relationships in 2026. So sit down, grab a snack, grab a notebook, because this is the ultimate lecture guide on avoidant attachment. And no, I will not be shaming you like the rest of the internet. I know the internet likes to villainize avoidantly attached people. In my opinion, I think that you are severely misunderstood. However, I do get why you have such a bad reputation. And in this lecture, we're also going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm not shaming you because I too am filled with a lot of avoidant tendencies. But at the same time, we have to understand how these tendencies may be hurting other people. Hi, if this is your first time seeing me, my name is Elena, and I'm a registered psychotherapist qualifying here in Toronto, Canada. I'm the owner and founder of Liminal Mind Therapy, where through evidence based practice and soul rooted guidance, we really help you reconnect with your inner wisdom and rewire your old patterns, stepping into the life that you truly want to live. I'm someone that used to be anxious in relationships, and I've healed my anxious attachment, and I'm now feeling a lot more secure. However, I have had avoidant tendencies my entire life with my family and with a lot of my friends. There's a couple ways that you can watch this lecture guide. You can watch it right here on TikTok. I'm going to put all the timestamps on the screen. You could also go to YouTube at Liminal Mind Therapy and watch it there. There is a guide that accompanies this lecture that is going to give you all of the resources that I talk about. You can access it in multiple ways. You can comment guide and I'll send it to you. You can email me guide and I'll send it to you. TikTok is still not letting me put things in my bio, but if you go on my Instagram at Liminal Mind Therapy, there's a link tree, and in that link tree, you'll be able to access all the avoidant attachment documents. If you would like to work with me one-on-one to really get to the root of your avoidant attachment and heal through it, I offer Canada-wide therapy and worldwide coaching. You can comment session down below or email me and we'll find the best option for you. Before we get into this, I want to let you know that this lecture is both for fearful and dismissive avoidance. However, if you know that you are fearful avoidant, please go watch my anxious attachment lecture series on my profile, because a lot of what you're going through and a lot of what you're experiencing on the anxious is very similar to someone with anxious attachment. And there's a lot of techniques there that will help that more fearful side of you, whereas this lecture will help more of that avoidant, dismissive side of you. Let's just jump right into it. And by the way, if you see me looking away, it's because my notes are down here. So, what is avoidant attachment? This is an adaptive strategy that has been developed to maintain safety and autonomy when closeness in your life felt unreliable, overwhelming, or intrusive. And avoidant attachment falls under the umbrella of insecure attachment styles. Points that you should know is that there's not a lack of need for connection, but instead it's a strategy that kind of tries to minimize that need. And we'll get into why. There's also an emphasis on self reliance, on independence, and on emotional containment. And love, for a lot of people who are avoidantly attached, has been experienced as being unsafe or, engulfing or destabilizing. So it's something that can be very overwhelming. And that's why a lot of these people really struggle in their romantic relationships. And avoidance is protection. Think of it as a shield. It's an armor. It's not indifference, although it comes across as indifference to a lot of people. We can kind of summarize this as like avoidant attachment is what happens when closeness costs too much, right? And maybe it doesn't cost that much right now, but it has in the past. How it feels for me is like this discomfort of closeness. It's like when certain people want to get close to me and want to kind of enter into my world, I just feel like shutting down. I don't want to let them in. And it makes me feel very uncomfortable. It's not necessarily anxiety that I notice, but it's like this like deep sensation of I don't want to open up and I kind of just want to keep everything to myself. But it also can show up as an overwhelm to like people's big emotions. So it's so interesting because my job as a therapist is to sit there and, if someone comes in a session and they're very heightened, then my job is to help regulate them. And that's something that I'm really good at doing. However, when it comes to my own life and people are coming at me with their big emotions or feeling very anxious, it pushes me into these avoidant tendencies. Now, there's two different types of avoidance. We have fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidance. Think about it on kind of like a spectrum, and you can fall somewhere within these two categories. But with fearful avoidance, people have both anxious and avoidant behaviors, which is why I suggested to go watch the lecture on anxious attachment. This person wants and craves love and intimacy, but they also have a very deep rooted fear of it from their past experience with love and what that showed up like in their life. They don't trust others, which is key, but they also don't trust themselves. So it's a very tricky and difficult thing to manage. And it often shows up as self-sabotage behaviors. So for example, when relationships get very deep, they get very serious, maybe the pressure becomes too big, they will often run away, essentially. They will often choose to end a relationship and sabotage it, for lack of better words, because it's too overwhelming. They don't trust that they can manage themselves. They also don't trust the other person to not hurt them. There's a big switch of closeness, and really craving that and becoming very close to someone. And then all of a sudden, maybe overnight, it's like they want to push people away. This can develop with a lot of people who have complex trauma from childhood, but it can also just develop based on various caregiver patterns or relationship styles. And we'll get into that a little bit more. With dismissive avoidance, which is the one that I kind of see more often, there's a lower desire or quote unquote need for love and connection. It's not that there's not a need for connection, it's that this person genuinely feels like I don't really need others that much, or I don't really want others around. And obviously, as humans, we do need connection, but dismissive avoidance don't feel that same desire as much as maybe the rest of the population does. There is a lack of trust in others, but there's usually a very deep trust and reliance in themselves. Because there's a decreased desire for love and connections, there's also a decreased desire for emotional depth. For commitment, these people may be more likely to engage in kind of like surface level relationships, hookup culture, kind of like jumping from one thing to the other because they also prefer novelty, and because they don't want to express their emotions as much through emotional suppression. They're not really forming deep bonds, and it can be a really like lonely and isolating life. But at the same time, like this is the life that makes a lot of people feel very comfortable. They're highly self-reliant and they're very independent, which is tying back to that whole thing of they don't really need others. So how does avoidant attachment develop? There's a couple different things that the research shows. The first is through emotionally unavailable caregiving. So this is when caregivers might have been unavailable for the child. They may have been dismissive to the child's needs. They may have been really overwhelmed and stressed as a caregiver, and because of that they aren't able to actually give the proper attention and attunement to the child. They also may have been very inconsistent, and it's a little bit different with anxious attachment. That kind of inconsistency, sometimes there's closeness, sometimes there's not. This inconsistency looks like maybe sometimes they'll be a little bit interested, at other times they're not interested at all, but the main thing is that they're not actually attuning to the child's emotions much. So what's really interesting is that mothers of avoidantly attached infants, they've seen that they exhibit kind of like a diminished interest the importance of bonding with their child and of being close with the infant. Like they don't really desire it or understand that it's really important as much as they should. In a series of experiments that were held by Mary Ainsworth, so basically these are the attachment experiments that are really, really interesting. Basically, what they did is they have a mother and her baby come into a room, okay, and kind of observe how the mother and the baby are interacting with each other. They then have a stranger come in the room. The mother and the baby get kind of situated with the stranger. The mother then leaves the room, and we see if the baby kind of interacts with the stranger. The stranger tries to kind of comfort the baby. The mother then comes back, so they watch to see how the mother and the baby reconnect, and then they basically from there can determine what type of attachment style someone has. So in the babies that were avoidantly attached, when they were with the mother, they were kind of indifferent. They maybe kind of turned their back. They didn't necessarily kind of like signal out to the mother as much, and they actually sometimes showed even more interest in the stranger. And when the mother left, they didn't show much distress. Whereas the anxious babies, they were crying, they were screaming, they really wanted the mother to come back. When the mother did come back, the avoidant babies didn't really seem to take too much attention to it. They kind of just did their own thing. And the mother also didn't signal and give much attention to the child either. Whereas for the anxious babies, the mother would kind of come back, she'd pick them up, but the baby would still be crying. Here, the avoidant baby is oftentimes not showing that type of emotion. So this is really interesting, and it brings us to our next point of this caregiver attitude of independence. You may be wondering, like, why would it be that a baby is not crying if the mother leaves it? Why would it be that they don't really care? So sometimes caregivers that are overwhelmed or dismissive or inconsistent, they may be reluctant to engage with the child, or they may feel that their engagement is not necessarily needed, that the baby can kind of do things on its own. The baby's fine, it's going to soothe itself. Oh yeah, sure, the baby's crying, but that's okay. It needs to learn how to regulate on its own. Or for a lot of parents, it's a very difficult thing to raise a child and to know what to do. So maybe they feel a little bit overwhelmed and they don't exactly know how to go about soothing their baby, so they choose to kind of avoid it in a way. And what that teaches the baby is that, okay, I need to manage on my own. Right, like I'm crying, no one's coming to save me, no one's coming to kind of help me regulate, so I need to start slowly doing that on my own. And the early internal learning of babies with avoidant attachment is that any sort of emotional expression leads to rejection or intrusion, right? So if I'm crying and I notice that the parent isn't coming to me, then that's rejection. So the baby basically learns that if it's on its own, it can be safe. It learns that if I depend on my caregiver, this is a bit dangerous because I don't know what to expect. I don't know if they're going to be there for me. I don't know if they're going to be able to help me manage and regulate these emotions. So the child basically learns my needs are too much for my caregiver, too much for my parent, so I'm safer on my own. What's really important to note though here is that avoidant attachment can actually develop, and it often, very often develops in very functional, high achieving, outwardly good families. For example, I'm from an immigrant family, I'm a second generation immigrant, and other friends who are also in this exact same kind of demographic, a lot of us have developed this type of avoidant attachment because our parents, I think it's for a couple reasons, but number one, I think that growing up, when your parents are in their own version of survival mode of trying to figure out, when's the next paycheck coming? Am I going to be able to pay all these bills? They're adjusting to a brand new country. They're learning a new language. They're basically like plopped into a new life and trying to figure things out while also needing to raise a child. It can be very difficult to give that child the amount of love and care and attention that it needs. And it's not due to malintent. It's not due to, I'm purposely neglecting this child or I'm purposely not doing the things that I need to for them, but it's because I need to make sure that I have enough money to provide for this child, that I can make sure there's a roof over their head, that they have clothing, that the whole family's taken care of. And unfortunately, by investing so much time into that, sometimes there's not enough time invested into the child. I think too, there's this common mentality. I know like my culture has it a lot where we believe like it's a cruel world and it's a tough world out there. And the way that my family kind of raised me was like, you have to figure things out on your own, like you have to be strong. You have to push through obstacles. You have to be able to manage by yourself. And for that reason, like, because that was their mindset, that's what was instilled in me. And that's also how a lot of this avoidance developed. But like I said, it can develop in these very functional, good families. However, obviously, it can also develop in very traumatic situations. It can be something pretty acute, but it can also be something really traumatic, right? Like a parent is completely neglectful and, leaving the child alone all the time, not tending to any of their needs. So it really kind of varies. And your experience may be very, very different than mine, but it all kind of encompasses a very similar belief for these children of, my needs my needs are too much and I'm not safe expressing them. So how does this show up in babies? So like I said, in those experiments that Mary Ainsworth did, there's this indifference to the caregiver. So there's limited distress when the caregiver leaves the room. There's not much, excitement when the caregiver comes back in the room. And this could just look like the baby not trying to interact with the caregiver as much. It's not as interested because the caregiver probably has rejected its advances. The second thing is reduced signaling for comfort. So, babies do a lot of things to try to interact with their environment and to try to interact with their caregivers. For example, they may coo, they may cry, they may babble, they may kind of reach out and try to grab things, all of that type of stuff as them signaling a need for something, right? I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm lonely, whatever it is, right? Like they wanting and needing something from the caregiver. Because the babies learn that its signals are kind of going, in through one ear and out the other, for lack of better words, it will reduce the signaling. It sees that it's ineffective, right? Its crying is ineffective because the caregiver is not tending to it. Its cooing behaviors are ineffective because the caregiver is not coming and picking up the baby or, giving them that love and affection and comfort that they might be looking for. And instead, what this can lead to is a lot of self-soothing behaviors. So, for example, babies might soothe themselves by like sucking their thumb or by like holding on to an object like a teddy bear or a blanket, or like kicking their legs, even like holding themselves, to help regulate on their own because the caregiver is kind of failing to do so. What's actually happening though for babies is that, their nervous system starts to get a little bit suppressed, right? Over time, they are in this like kind of like constant panic mode for a long time. Because it's at the root of all of this, it's anxiety, right? A caregiver not responding to you crying makes you feel anxious, and it initiates that threat response. It initiates the baby to kind of go into fight or flight and overdrive. The thing is, when that happens time and time and time again, what would break the threat response is for the caregiver to come and pick up the baby and give it some affection, give it some attention. But if the caregiver fails to do that time and time again, then that baby is eventually going to learn to manage this threat response on its own. And that's why it might hold itself. That's why it might suck its thumb. That's why it might just stop crying and stop being interested in the caregiver. And it's not that a baby is like actually technically calm, it's that its nervous system has just kind of suppressed these emotions. Because there's an absence of distress, that doesn't mean there's an absence of need. Just because the baby doesn't signal for the parent, it doesn't mean that it doesn't need it, right? We all need parents to be there when we're babies and to help guide us through life and to help give us that love and affection. How does it show up in kids. One really common thing I see is this early maturation, where kids will be told, "Oh, you're so mature for your age. Like, wow, you've like, you know so much. You've grown up so fast." And, it's a lot of times because these kids have had to really show up for themselves for years without the caregiver's support as much. And that itself can create a very mature child, but a child that's too mature for the developmental stage that they should be at. A lot of times it can kind of feel like not really getting to have a full childhood sometimes, to the extent, and obviously this can vary based on the extent of avoidance and the extent of what the caregiver's behavior was like. And there's discomfort with comfort. So this is like one of the main things that I noticed growing up. And it's like this weird sensation of like, in those moments when you should feel comfortable, you feel uncomfortable. And you can start noticing this as a kid. So, for example, not feeling comfortable really opening up to their family, right? Like, maybe it's parent teacher interviews, and the teacher is trying to get the kid to, maybe disclose a couple things to their parent, and they do not feel comfortable at all because it doesn't feel like a safe space that they can really tell the parent what they're thinking or what they're feeling or how school is like for them. Another thing, and I would notice it like this, is like in moments of being around, close family. Uh, that should be a very exciting and fun and comfortable experience. If the caregivers have kind of failed to make a deep connection with the child at this point, they can find the more time that they have to spend with the parents can actually feel very unnerving for them, right? Because they don't really know what to expect. And also, they don't really have that bond with them. So, like, spending time with them feels weird because they didn't have a lot of that as a kid, as a baby. So now that they're getting more of it, it just feels off. It feels uncomfortable for them. Another thing is a big difficulty in naming emotions. So, kids can feel a lot of emotions at this time, but maybe they just don't really know what they are. They might experience tantrums, they might experience anger or sadness, but because they were really never taught emotional regulation, or, because they were also suppressing their emotions so much, they don't get to express them and know what they are. In teens, it shows up in a variety of different ways. So, one thing that we notice is emotional withdrawal from everyone, but especially from the parents. And, the teenage years are already very turbulent. And obviously, teens may be emotionally withdrawn for a variety of reasons, but teens that are more avoidant will oftentimes show a lot more withdrawal from the parents. Like I remember for me, oh my God, I did not want to tell anyone anything. I did not want to let anyone in for even something so simple. Like I would just kept such a secretive life from my family and from a lot of my friends. There was a lot of withdrawal emotionally. I did not express a single emotion of anything for years and years and years in my life. Another thing is irritability or discomfort when talking about their feelings. So sometimes when teens that have avoidant attachment are asked about their feelings, they may feel very irritable. They just get a little bit angry about it. I remember for me, like it would freak me out if someone would try to ask me or try to pry, like, how does this make you feel? Or if they were trying to get some sort of emotion out of me and elicit a response, I would get so irritable and so angry. And I do think that the root of that anger just came because, it's like, well, I don't know how to do this. I have no idea how to express an emotion. I have no idea how to emotionally regulate. So, because you don't know how to regulate, because it was never modeled by the parents, feeling emotions can feel scary and dangerous because you don't know what to do with them, right? Like you can feel anger, you can feel sadness, you can feel grief or shame or whatever, but then what, right? Like what happens next? So it's safer to just not feel it at all. So it's more suppressed. And if you do feel it, there may be a big discomfort of talking about those feelings. And you may only feel really comfortable sharing that with a very select few people. Final thing is a desire for privacy and control. So because these teens are already, going through that emotional withdrawal, they're kind of uncomfortable in a lot of situations. They may go through this really deep desire to just kind of keep everything to themselves. And that can look like, excessive diary or journal writing, staying up late at night so that they can finally have time to themselves, when the family's sleeping, choosing to kind of do solo activities rather than maybe like, be with others or play with others. The eternal experience of a lot of these teens and kids at this time is self criticism, very high self criticism, right? Because if they've already gone through a significant portion of time in their life where the parents are a bit distant, a bit dismissive, they may not really be pouring into the kid as much as they should, as much as a secure parent might, um, then this kid may not feel that great about themselves, right? I remember in middle school and in high school, I noticed a huge difference in certain kids in comparison to me. The thing that really like made me almost like shocked was how confident so many kids were. They would raise their hand up and want to answer every question. They would go and comfortably walk up to the teacher and just like talk to them. They were so good at interacting with adults, and they just kind of like did things, like they joined clubs. They wore cool clothes to school. Like they seemed so like full of life. And I always thought like, wow, like I wonder what it's like in their parents' relationship. Like I wonder how their parents are interacting with them. And a lot of these kids, I would actually ask questions, and I would come to learn like their parents were so supportive. They'd show up to all their games. They would really go above and beyond to like fill them with positive affirmations from a young age. So these kids with avoidant attachment most likely never got any of that, right? Unless, a lot of times they were told the exact opposite, or just never given that parental support and sort of push. So there's high self-criticism, there's a fear of being exposed, being looked at as needy or as dependent, which is why these kids hide their emotions and they want to suppress because they don't want anyone to think of them in that negative way. And their identity has really been built around being competent and being independent, like just being quiet and just doing what you should do and just being good at it and not really letting other people in. Now, in adult relationships is where it gets, I think, the most tricky, and where the true bad reputation of avoidance has been built, because I know the internet loves to rip and tear avoidant people apart. And I think part of why I wanted to even do this lecture series is to get people to understand why we behave the way that we do. So, in adults, there is a very noticeable difficulty with intimacy. This can be both physical and emotional intimacy. They can just feel very uncomfortable actually being physically close and affectionate with people. For example, that can be in public and in private. PDA, absolutely not for a lot of these people. That private affection can feel weird at first because a lot of these adults never got that as a child. They didn't get the hugging and the cuddling, or the I love yous and all of that. So when someone is giving that to them, it feels foreign, it feels strange. They have to kind of warm up to it. The emotional intimacy, that looks more like opening up to others and allowing their needs and internal states and expressions to be known. And that can feel so scary because they didn't have that intimacy with their parents, so therefore it's difficult to do that with a partner. Like I mentioned before, depending on the level of avoidance, there can be pulling away when a relationship gets too close, when it gets too deep, when it feels too serious and too real. They start to get scary because these situations start to mimic those attachment needs, right? Okay, if I get so close with someone, if I start relying on them, what if they now behave or react to me the way that my caregivers did? And oftentimes this isn't a conscious thought process, right? But okay, in order to protect myself and not get hurt, I need to pull away. That's the logic behind it. Another big thing is emotional shutdown. And emotional shutdown can be a very frustrating thing to deal with. And I've been on both ends, right? I've been on the anxious end in relationships. I've also been on the avoidant end. And I will say that it's very tricky to be on the anxious side or be on the secure side and deal with someone who is constantly pushing you away. But there's a reason as to why that's happening. This is dynamic, the anxious avoidant dynamic, where the avoidant person is very attracted to the anxious person because they're warm, they're open, they're inviting, they care about them, they're expressive. They basically give them everything that their parents didn't give them. So they're filling this massive void for them. It's also terrifying because it's not what their nervous system is used to. They're used to people being distant and cold. They're used to people not caring as much. They're used to people not showing them much interest or attention or curiosity. So now that someone's doing that, their brain is like, wait, this is wrong. This doesn't make sense. Like, this is scary. And I can't even take a gamble on this. So I'm going to pull away. But pulling away can also just look like shutting down. It's like difficulties resolving conflict, or, trouble processing emotions. So like if you're trying to have a conversation with them and resolve something, they may just go kind of quiet. They may go mute. They may not have anything to say. It can look like just wanting space and wanting time, and having needing that way more than reassurance. And it's a really tricky cycle because the other partner is looking for reassurance, but the avoidant partner isn't. And that's where there's a really tricky divide. The final big thing is intellectualization. So people with avoidant attachment are a lot more logical and rational because they're not really tapping into that emotional side of themselves, and they may not even really feel comfortable or in tune at all with all those internal things that they're feeling. So logic and rationality is the main thing that's standing out to them, and they can be really highly resistant to emotional expression. It's something that is like foreign. It can feel very uncomfortable. These are some of the common behaviors of avoidance. So first is emotional minimization, and this can look like minimizing their own feelings or the feelings of others, right? So something happens to them, oh, it's not a big deal, like whatever. They're just gonna kind of bury it away. They're not gonna think about it too much. But this can also look like if a partner is expressing something to them, bringing up a problem, they don't logically maybe see an issue with it because they're not tapping into the emotional aspect of what their partner is saying. Okay, therefore it gets written off as not a big deal. And this can be a really big problem in relationships. Another really common thing is deactivation strategies, right? So as we talked about, like this avoidant attachment is like an adaptation, right? It's an adaptation to manage all of these uncomfortable feelings. So one way to do that is through leaving the situation, right? Deactivating completely. That can look like ghosting. That can look like, being so busy and just staying so distracted so you're not thinking about things. That can look like just finding any reason to leave because there's a fear of getting too close and too deep and too serious and hurt. So it's easier to kind of walk away and prevent that. There's been times in my life where I am at this very critical moment in a conflict with somebody. I'm fully in the height of my avoidance. Like my armor is all the way up. And somebody is coming at me with, problems or with anxiety or whatever big emotion that they're facing. And they're basically trying to break through my armor. And it is making tiny little dents. And I start getting scared because we're fully going to crack through this foundation. They're going to crack through my armor. And that discomfort that I feel in the moment with their emotions is sometimes so large that the automatic thought that comes to my brain is I rather never talk to this person again than have to deal with this right now, than have to sit here and like kind of help attune to their emotions. I rather just walk away and like end the relationship, or I rather just end the friendship. And obviously, this is not a rational thought. This is an emotional thought. If I was using rationality and logic, I would obviously regret that decision. However, I do think in some situations that discomfort is so strong that it's almost like feels worth it to the avoidant person to lose out on that relationship. There's over intellectualization, right? Using a lot of logic and rationality. There's hyper independence. Often an avoidance of vulnerability, not wanting to really let many people in, if anyone, not wanting to show that they're vulnerable. And a lot of people see vulnerability as, if they cry or if they're sad or if they're upset or if there's any sort of shift in their baseline emotions, that is being vulnerable. There may also be a delayed processing of emotions. So, maybe in the moment they're having a conflict or something happens and they're not really phased by it, but then later on it kind of hits them. It takes some time for the emotions to kind of really go through. You may feel a lot of somatic tension, which is like, for example, like tight jaw, tight shoulders, like pit in your stomach, all of those type of things, but without really being emotionally aware of what that is linked to or even like noticing that it's happening. What I found so interesting when I was doing this research is the physiology behind avoidance. So as we talk, there's this chronic sympathetic activation that has been masked as being calmness, right? The baby's been in overdrive for so long that eventually its nervous system just kind of suppresses emotions. It's a very like long-term overdrive. It becomes the norm. When we talk about anxious attachment, oftentimes there is, a fight or flight. We start doing some behaviors to kind of bring that anxiety down. Here we go more into freeze, we go more into collapse. And this can happen in times of confrontation, conflict, intimacy, any time where it's really triggering our nervous system. It can go into a point of being numb, okay, where we just do nothing. We kind of shut down. It can actually look like physically freezing, being unable to move. Having trouble accessing words, stumbling over your words, like your thoughts being all jumbled, or like just having a completely blank mind. And sometimes even it can even go as strong as feeling disassociated. What we also notice is that there's limited interoceptive awareness. So the ability to kind of perceive those internal sensations like, hunger, heart rate, breath, tension, all of those type of things becomes a little bit more impaired. With anxiety and anxious attachment, we notice that there is a decreased sense of activity in the prefrontal cortex, right? Because that threat response, it activates all these different hormones that are basically impairing our prefrontal cortex. And that is the area of our brain that has to do with rational, logical thinking, making decisions. However, for people who are more avoidant, there's actually increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. So this is so interesting because they're suppressing those other regions that are dealing with emotions, and instead they're increasing the region that's dealing with logic and rationality, which makes sense as to why they over intellectualize everything. The amygdala, which is responsible for processing different threats in our environment, is less reactive. So it doesn't pick up to maybe the same attachment related stimuli that someone who is more anxious might. So this is also why there may be a tendency to kind of downplay the need and desire for emotional connections because they may not perceive someone reaching out to them as like a bid for connection as much as someone who is anxious, right? Both the anterior cingulate cortex and the inferior frontal gyrus, which are areas that are involved in emotional regulation and processing and empathy, they show reduced activity or sometimes actually complete deactivation during emotional processing, which is so interesting because a lot of times people say to me, avoidant people have no empathy, like, oh, my partner, he has absolutely no empathy. And I guess now we can see the science behind it because those centers are decreased. So someone with avoidant attachment in these moments of, conflict or and anything that's triggering them, they may not be as empathetic as somebody who is more anxious. What's really interesting is that parents of these avoidantly attached babies, when they did some research and studies found that they had lower activation in their brain areas that were related to reward when they saw photos of their children. Like positive social images, such as photos of their children, um, which is kind of sad if you think about it. But this also kind of explains why they may have had less of a drive or desire for that social bond with the baby. And one of the final things is, oxytocin is a bonding hormone that's really important, and babies start developing and kind of regulating this hormone. As they are being affectionate with their caregiver. Now, because a lot of these avoidant individuals may have not experienced that as much, they may have had limited exposure to oxytocin. It can make it more difficult to feel like connection and warmth and trust and safety in their relationships as adults. Let's get into the psychology of avoidance. So, first, we got to look at these core beliefs, okay? Core beliefs are anything that we hold very, very deep in us, and this can also be connected to kind of like the core wounds that we have. Common one is that needing others is dangerous, right? So because the child's needs were unmet by their caregiver, they are basically taught to not seek others, and the danger can vary. Danger doesn't actually necessarily mean that your life is in danger. It's like a life or death situation, that you're in like a serious sense of threat. But for a baby, to be crying and a parent to not be able to comfort it properly, or for a child to kind of go and show their parent, hey, like I did this really cool thing, and the parent to kind of be cold and not care about that, or a teen to try to open up to their family and to be met with a negative reaction of, the parents saying that they're stupid or that they're worthless or that they don't know what they're doing. That is dangerous in a way, like in our brain, that's seen as danger. Another thing is I'm safest when I rely on myself. So there's a difficulty relying on caregivers, conditions a child to not feel really safe relying on anyone. I think that this happens a lot in that childhood and teen stage where they realize that they have to just kind of go through the world and learn a lot of things by themselves. The parents are not there to provide as much guidance or as much support. Or once, like I said, maybe the parents have that mentality and the attitude of like, you just need to take life by the ropes and do it on your own. So if they can't rely on the parents to kind of pave the path and help them through difficult situations that they might be going to, and especially if they don't feel comfortable sharing that with them, then they're only going to rely on themselves. If I feel things, I'm considered weak. So a lot of people grew up in families where showing emotion was genuinely considered to be a weakness. Crying, if you're crying, they're gonna laugh at you. They might minimize your feelings. If you express that you're going through a hard time or that you don't know how to do something, they may call you stupid. They may get mad at you for not knowing, you know, something. It's really unfortunate because obviously I don't think parents try to do that with ill intent. Obviously there are some that do, but a lot of times like they were raised in that same harsh way, so they kind of just do that to us. And a final really big core wound, and it's almost the exact same wound with anxious attachment, is I am unworthy of care or love. If the caregivers have failed to show affection and love to that child, then that child may feel like, well, if the people who are supposed to love me, who are supposed to care about me, who are supposed to validate me and reassure me and really make me feel good about who I am, if they haven't given me any of that, then I'm just not worthy of receiving it, right? Like I must not be good enough. I must just be someone that doesn't deserve good things. And this is where they can really have a big struggle in their relationships to let people do nice things for them and let people actually give them love. And we will get a lot more into anxious avoidant dynamics. That's going to be an entire other lecture series of like how those relationships are impacting each other and how people can work together. But this lecture is more on like the avoidant person themselves. I want to present you with a little bit of a theory so that we can better understand avoidance and also how to kind of help heal through it. So this is internal family systems, which is one of my favorite things to use with my clients. But essentially this theory suggests that there's different subpersonalities, parts basically, that are, connected to various thoughts, feelings, and sensations that all have their own roles, their own beliefs, and their own memories. So think of yourself as a part of many. And there's all these different parts that are kind of working together to make you you. So we have managers. These are these proactive parts. They kind of jump in tend to help control situations and prevent pain. So, for example, maybe that's our perfectionistic tendencies. Maybe that's our very critical tendencies that we have, right? They're proactive, they're trying to prevent. Then we have our firefighters. These are the more reactive parts that try to distract or numb us from painful feelings. So, for example, these are maybe the parts of us that dabble in substance use or, self injury or distraction behaviors, even like scrolling on your phone, the ones that are addicted to, um, TikTok and whatnot. Those are all the firefighters because they're trying to put out the fire, right? Then we have the exiles. So the firefighters and the managers kind of like work together to protect the exiles. These are these young, wounded core parts of ourselves that are holding on to trauma, to shame, to fear, and they're often buried deep inside. Because the managers and the firefighters don't want them to come to the surface because it kind of might overwhelm the system. The self is this very like deep core version of us that's filled with its own innate wisdom, with compassion, with calmness, with clarity and courage. And everyone has this. That's why I always tell people like all the answers are within you. Like there's only, I can help guide you to that, but all the answers that you need are already within. We just need to get comfortable with the self and we need to access it. So the self works to help the system function and it can really bring the entire system together because a lot of times these parts kind of work on their own and they're all trying to take over. The self can help them coexist. How does this actually look in avoidant attachment? Avoidant behaviors come from these protector parts, okay? They're often driven by those managers, right? The parts whose role is to keep all the things contained, right? These are going to be, our intellectualizer, the self-reliant one, the numb one, the busy one. All of these parts of us that are trying to keep everything under emotional control. But what are they actually protecting, right? They're often protecting those younger parts that learned our emotions aren't going to be met, If I need others, it's going to lead to disappointment. Like vulnerability feels really unsafe and overwhelming. And closeness comes with way too much pressure and responsibility. So all these little young parts of us are deep in there and these protector parts need to kind of step in. One thing I've noticed, and I noticed this in myself too, is that avoidant parts really resist change, right? Because they're afraid that if we heal, it's going to mean that we lose our independence. We become way too dependent on others, and that is scary. That's unsafe. It's too much of a gamble. If we heal, we might get way too flooded with emotion because now we don't know how to manage it. How would we even be able to go through that? They may feel like they are going to be forced into vulnerability. I'm here to tell you that that's not what we're going to do. And that's not what healing has to look like. But how do we actually heal these parts? And healing isn't removing the avoidant parts, it's basically just updating them and letting them kind of lose their grip a little bit. We don't force vulnerability. We're also not trying to eliminate distance because I can see how both of these things are beneficial to some extent. But what we do is we're going to work on allowing the self to observe everything without panic. Okay. This is something that I really recommend that you do. Okay. We're going to do a little guided reflection to meet your avoidant protectors because you may be listening to this and saying, like, Elena, like, that is just so abstract. Like, what does that even mean? Okay. So, what we're going to do is if you want to do this, you can do it now. If not, you can do it at your own time. Either way, there's a sheet that goes along with this. So, you want to take a moment to get comfortable. Sit down, be in a quiet place, whatever it is, just arrive exactly as you are. And if at any point this feels too much, you can just stop. You can open your eyes. You can stop listening. You can, fast forward a little bit, but you're in charge. Okay. So, what we want to do is first notice our protector very gently. So, bring to mind a recent moment where you wanted space. It doesn't have to be necessarily a dramatic one, it can be something small, something where you've noticed that you wanted to pull away, shut down, change the subject, be alone, stay busy, any of those things. You don't have to relive it here, but you just want to notice what that urge was. Okay. Then we're going to name it as a part. We're not looking at it as a problem. So, we might say, okay, a part of me recently wanted distance, that's it. A part of me wanted distance. Notice how it feels to kind of describe it as a part, but not you, right? Instead of saying I wanted distance, okay, no, this part of me wanted distance. Now we're going to try to acknowledge its intention, right? This part that wanted distance is trying to protect me, right? At this point, we don't have to know why or how, but we just want to let this idea kind of land. And this might not resonate with you right now because you might think, like, well, what did this part even try to protect me from? But just think about it in that sense, right? Part of me really wanted distance the other day from whatever, right? And it was just trying to protect me. Next, let's get a little curious, okay? We're not trying to invade in these parts, but we want to just kind of ask. You may not get a clear answer, but sit there, close your eyes, and literally visualize yourself and visualize that part next to you. It can look like you, it can look like whatever, anything. And just ask it, what are you trying to protect me from? You're doing this from a sense of curiosity, and that part may not say anything back to you. It's still a valid response. As you're asking this part, if it is responding to you, great, take note of what it's saying. You can let it know you don't have to change. You don't have to go anywhere. I'm just noticing you right now. I noticed that you're there. And I noticed that you're doing something to help me. And I thank you for that. We can gently reflect. So in this example, like, distance did help me at some point, right? You don't have to connect it right now as to where it did help you, but there was a some point in your life where that distance was really key and you really needed it for your survival. If it feels safe, you can add one more line internally. You know, I'm learning that I can choose to be distant instead of distance choosing me, right? Like I'm learning that I actually can control slowly when and how I choose to be distant, when and how I choose to pull away, rather than, that distance and pulling away choosing me. It's just something to kind of let the part know, like, hey, like you can loosen your grip a little bit. And I would end this off with just saying, thank you for keeping me safe. And that's a little meditation. You can repeat this for many different parts. You can repeat this for many different scenarios. Okay. And when you're done, just open your eyes. You're back in the room. You're here. Another theory that I love is emotion focused therapy. And we talk about this in the anxious lectures as well. So, EFT says that avoidance in general is a protective, maladaptive strategy to suppress or run from painful emotions such as fear, shame, and guilt that signal unmet needs or attachment injuries. And look at avoidance as basically being this upper layer, like I said, this protector to these unmet core needs, right? Whether that's fear of not being worthy, fear of not being good enough, fear of being seen as weak or vulnerable. Maybe it's shame, feeling shameful that I am a bad person because maybe your parents fed you those ideas, maybe a lot of the distance that you experience with them is because they were rude to you or they kind of like tore you down rather than build you up. So you start internalizing that and thinking, yeah, like I am stupid, I am weak, I am, worthless. You start internalizing those things, and the behaviors that are related to avoidance, they provide short-term relief, but the problem is that it blocks deeper processing and connection, because if you're always running away from things, you're never going to actually face them head on. So while I'm here saying that I understand some of the benefits of avoidance and it's actually helped me through many different things in my life, in order to have fulfilling connections in relationships and to also like face yourself, you need to face this avoidance, right? I don't think there's a way around it. I think it comes to a point of deciding and desiring to make a change. So it really begs the questions like, how can we meet these inner needs that weren't met? And to me, the answer is self trust. And I talked about this whole concept of self trust in the other lectures too. So I think that it's stemmed to this deep fear of, if I let people in, there's a chance that they may see me for who I truly am. And that may confirm all of these core wounds, all these negative things that I deeply think about myself. And if they do, then how will I manage? If they do see me as that person, what do I do then? If they see that and they decide to leave, how do I go about everything? You need to trust that you're able to express and feel your emotions and that you can manage them on your own. You need to trust that you are able to develop connections with others. And even if they don't go the way that you want them to, you will be okay and you will be able to continue from there. You need to trust in others, but you can't trust in others if you don't trust in yourself. So yes, while people with avoidant tendencies may trust themselves, for example, like, oh, they know that they're disciplined, so they might, wake up and go to the gym and work on their business ideas and do all of that. They may not have a deeper inner trust of managing their emotions and being able to deal with those underlying things like fear and shame and guilt. Now, common misconceptions, I think there's so many, is that people with avoidant tendencies don't care. And I think that's actually the complete opposite. For example, I'm someone who can care so deeply, but I think because of some of these avoidant tendencies and the uncomfortableness with emotional expression at times, especially affection, it can be rubbed off on people as if like I don't care as much. And especially in the anxious avoidant dynamic, the way that the anxious person might need the avoidant person to show up is might be too much for the avoidant person. And then that person doesn't show up like that. And that signals, okay, this is a lack of care. They can't love. Absolutely not true. Humans can love very deeply. It's just that they may not feel safe expressing it, right? They're evil people. They're abusive. Obviously, you can be avoidant and be abusive, but you can also be anxious and be abusive. You can be secure and be abusive. So I think that is a very, very harmful overgeneralization. And I will absolutely never agree with that statement. And avoidants are also not evil people. I understand why they get the reputation that they do. And I think if you're an avoidant person watching this, to give you a little bit of perspective, like I said, I'm not here to shame you. I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to tell you that you have to, be a certain way. But I'm here to remind you that at a certain part in our life, it's exactly what I told the people with anxious attachment. At a certain part in our life, we have to take control of ourselves and our actions. And we cannot let the experiences of the past continue to define who we are now and continue to be reasons or excuses for why we potentially hurt others. We see it every day in my job, and I've seen it in my own life too. There is this dynamic between an avoidant person and someone else, typically an anxious person in relationships where they actually both deeply hurt each other. If I'm stepping into the perspective of the anxious person, when you're dealing with avoidance, it can be extremely frustrating because you're here pouring everything out to somebody and they meet you with sometimes nothing. Or even worse, they decide to walk away. And then that kind of further impacts the anxious person because they now start to think, okay, all these negative things I think about myself are true, right? Because this person decided to leave. This person decided to not give me the things that I want and need. I think where avoidance can get like a little bit more dangerous is if you are very aware that your actions are hurting someone and you see the distress that it's causing to them. However, you are not taking any action to understand them better, to make changes, even if it's just small little changes. That's where I think it's very unfair. Of course, the anxious person has their own role to play and they have to be held accountable too. And that's what I talked about in my lecture. But in this lecture, it's about you. And it's about not just for them, for yourself. Because I know how that aftermath feels like of hurting somebody with your avoidant tendencies. And I know that it doesn't feel good. It feels like shit. And it further emphasizes those feelings of fear and guilt and shame. Now, I want to give you a little bit about my experience. So, I grew up in a family that, from a young age, mainly my dad, he told me this is a hard world. It's a cruel world. It's a cold world. And you got to figure it out because he was that same type. He figured it all out. And honestly, that mentality actually helped me a lot in life. I was able to really push through so many obstacles and challenges because it was almost like blindly led into them by myself. And I had to figure out everything. I had to like learn all the ropes on my own, which I think can be an extremely beneficial thing. I find that I'm a very resilient person. I have a lot of internal self trust that I've built throughout the years, and it's made me into someone who's very disciplined, who's very hardworking, and who's very pragmatic. And I can see the world for what it is, but I very much believe and am confident in myself. And I think a lot of that has been instilled because of those beliefs. I've learned from a young age that, my emotions aren't going to be met with people who know how to regulate them. No one in my family really knew how to regulate themselves. So that made it even more difficult for me. And actually, I ended up being the one regulating people quite often. But what that meant is that, well, my emotions don't really have anywhere to go. So might as well just not feel them. And the way that it would translate for me is like this intense privacy and secrecy. And it still happens to this very day where even something as simple as what did you do at work today? How many clients did you see? What are you doing on the weekend? Even questions like that from certain people, it's like a trigger to me. And I just get into this very deep sensation of I don't want to answer this. And I want to change the subject as quick as possible because I don't want the focus to be on me because I don't feel comfortable with it. Throughout my life, there's been many times where the focus was not on me and I had to kind of blend into the background. So when the focus is on me, I'm uncomfortable because I don't feel like I can express it as much. A lot of that was connected to this fear of vulnerability. If I express that I'm going through something difficult, I can see because of past evidence in my life, it's going to be met with a lot of backlash. I'm going to be called weak. I'm going to be called stupid. I'm going to be told that, like this is something stupid to be sad over. So I'm just not going to mention that to anyone. I saw this tweet and it was so funny because it was so spot on. It's like, I'm so avoidant that I can't even journal because I find it cringe to talk about my feelings. Like, I just find that cringe. And I think that's a mindset that I've had for so long about myself. Like when I would want to share certain things, I would just think like, oh, that's so cringe. And I've grown out of that mindset years ago. But for a very long time in my life, I did not express any emotion other than just neutrality. I'm not showing excessive positive emotions and I'm not showing any negative emotions. It's just kind of like blank. Like anxiety is so debilitating, right? So it made me really want to get rid of my anxious attachment because I hated feeling that anxiety. I hated just being so all over the place. Whereas avoidance to me, it didn't produce those same negative effects. Like, yeah, I feel uncomfortable, but I'm not feeling like super anxious. I'm not like, blowing off the charts. However, I do think that avoidance is a lot more damaging because it's led to those things that I mentioned before of like, I rather lose this whole relationship than change, than express something, than hear you out right now because your anxiety or your emotions are so uncomfortable for me to face because they're probably reflecting something about whatever. I don't even know. I rather just not hear it. And I'd rather just cut you off and I'd rather just not talk about it ever again. And there's been times in my life where I've done that. But I have worked so hard to push past that because I know that that is not a good way to build healthy relationships. And I think that's where avoidance can get really damaging because you can sabotage so many relationships with amazing people who really genuinely truly care about you. Your discomfort outweighs the desire of keeping that person in your life. And I made a video where I said, like, it comes down to desire. You have to desire to want to be different. You have to desire to want to keep that connection more than desiring to get rid of the discomfort that you feel. How do we actually heal avoidance? Okay. It really boils down to increasing your tolerance with discomfort. You're going to need to basically get to a point where, we're not taking away your independence, but we're going to make it less lonely for you to do that because we're going to get you to feel more comfortable with feeling a little bit strange, for a while. The key is that you need to have a desire to change and you need to trust that you can manage yourself. Desire can come from so many different things for you, but I think one of the strongest things is like if you want to have a healthy, secure relationship, it's very difficult to do so with avoidant tendencies, right? Same way that it's very difficult to do so with anxious tendencies. Therefore, that can be the driving change, right? And especially if you don't want this behavior to then be kind of like mimicked onto your children, and you don't want to end up being that same type of parent, this is a really good point to make a shift. You can really find a healthy balance between these behaviors. I'm not saying to completely eliminate all avoidant behaviors because I can see the benefit and merit of some of them, but we can strengthen the connections and add to them without actually completely losing yourself. And at the end of the day, a really harsh reality and truth is your behavior may be very hurtful and confusing to others, right? And you may be driving people into a complete emotional and anxious meltdown. It's this thing of like, obviously, we're not responsible for other people's emotions, but at the same time, if we're doing certain actions that we know are harming others and we have the ability to potentially lighten that up, and it's something can be as simple as like, if we're in a conflict and we just decide to like not say anything and then just like completely ignore the whole conflict, our partner is going to be like freaking out, and that's not fair to them, right? But it's also same way as how I told the people with anxious attachment, like it's not fair to like push and push and push and be so intrusive to our partner as well. So we will get more into the dynamics in another lecture, but we're going to do this in a 5-phase format. Okay, phase 1 is nervous system awareness. We need to start getting comfortable with our internal states, and we're going to do that by building interoception. Okay, so we want to understand what is going on in our body because we may not have had that experience of really just getting comfortable with our internal states. We're not trying to identify any emotions or make meaning yet at this stage, but we just want to understand what's going on. And the way that you're going to do this is daily, maybe once a day, twice a day. You're going to sit down and you're going to do a 5-minute body check and scan. Okay. You're going to sit down and get comfortable and you're basically going to start externally. Okay. You're going to go on your body. Okay. What do I feel? I feel my hair. I feel my shirt. Oh, how does it feel? Okay, it's soft. It's a little bit rough. I feel my pants. I'm wearing sweatpants. They're nice and like smooth. The fleece feels comfortable. I feel my necklace. It's hard. I feel my nose. I feel my nose ring. Whatever, right? Externally. Then we go internally. What do I feel internally right now? Okay, for me right now, I feel my stomach and it's grumbling because I'm actually really hungry. I noticed that my throat is a little bit dry because I haven't drank water in a little bit. I noticed that my legs kind of hurt a little bit from the way that I'm sitting on this chair. You may not be feeling anything super significant internally, but the point is to start getting comfortable with recognizing what's going on because that's going to help us with the emotional development later. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is track our avoidance. In order to make any change, we need to first understand what are the behaviors that we need to change. So I created this little tracker for you. It's very similar to the anxious one. So what we're going to do is, you're going to put in the month, you're going to put in the week. I suggest that you track for a few weeks just so that you can start noticing some patterns. But first, you want to identify the trigger. So this is any situation that triggered you to maybe like, like withdraw, to pull away. You felt discomfort, uncomfortable, whatever it is. This is the trigger, and you want to like list what that was. So my partner decided to talk about the future, right? Or my parents asked me how school's going, whatever it is. Okay. Then you want to say what you felt internally. And this doesn't necessarily have to be an emotion. Sometimes it can just be like an instinct or a desire. So for example, like I had a deep desire to just like leave the room when my partner said that, or when my parents asked me about school, I just became emotionally blank. You want to say, what did you actually do? Right? Like, oh, I left the room, or oh, maybe I switched the subject, or oh, maybe I did talk about it but I felt really uncomfortable. And you want to rate your discomfort on a scale of 1 to 10. So the goal here is to start understanding what is triggering you most often and what is creating the most discomfort, and we can look at that and kind of break those patterns down. And if you want to do this with someone, you can book a session with me and we go through this tracker and better understand like why these behaviors are creating so much discomfort. But this is the first step. You need to basically know what's going on and be aware of it. Okay, at the same time, while we're tracking this avoidance avoidance, what we're going to start doing is somatic practice. So these are like mini little micro practices that you're going to do to start feeling a bit more comfortable with slowing down, with being more present. It's gonna be a very micro practice. And I say micro because for me, I hated any kind of meditation before or grounding because it kind of made me feel uncomfortable. It's like, oh, I have to sit here. I have to think about things. I have to feel things. I have to like be aware of what's going on inside me. I don't want to do that. But the thing is you have to. Like you need to be comfortable with the discomfort, right? So what you're gonna do is you're gonna sit down and just do a very short breathing exercise. So you're gonna just sit down, you're gonna, rest your feet on the floor or lie down in your bed, just drop your shoulders and close your eyes and just breathe in, hold it for a few seconds, breathe out. Okay. If you feel good, you can kind of put your hand on your chest. You're just gonna do that a few times and just sit there. And if any thoughts come up, just let them kind of come up. You don't have to push them away. Um, and slowly you can start moving into other kind of meditative practices that might look like yoga, Pilates, even just walking outside and like looking at everything very intently. Other little movements to just slowly increase your awareness. So, because in this stage, we just really want to get our nervous system feeling a bit more on and aware and comfortable. I want to share these grounding techniques with you because in the anxious attachment guide, what we looked at more was these techniques that are important for the system overwhelm, right? Like that overdrive. But here, you are more likely in that collapse stage, the fawn, the freeze. So these are some things that you can try out. I'm not going to go through them, but you can try these out for those moments where you are feeling a bit disconnected, or you do end up pulling away and you're feeling a little bit like withdrawn. These are some things that can kind of help your nervous system turn back on and get back to baseline. Phase two is emotional literacy and tolerance. What we want to do is help to expand your vocabulary so that you can better understand what it is that's going on inside, and also increase your emotional stamina so that you can feel more comfortable experiencing emotions. So to expand your vocabulary, what we want to do is give a name to emotion, because I believe that when we know what's going on in us and we can put a name to it, it gives those emotions less power. So now we can kind of just ride the wave of them rather than letting them take over us. And we can do this by kind of branching it into broad terms such as, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, energizing, draining. You don't have to go super in depth, but if you would like to, this is an emotion wheel where you can start off with a more broad category and then go deeper in so that you can give your emotion an accurate name. And this is just, it takes practice. It takes some time to better understand what emotion you are going through. With building emotional stamina, like I said, you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So we basically, we don't need to get super deep, but we need to increase our time under tension. It's kind of like at the gym. You're going to want to perform your reps nice and slow so that your muscles can be contracted for a longer time and therefore you will have better growth. So same thing here. The way that we're going to do that is by staying embodied. So when an emotion arises, you want to basically challenge yourself to sit with it even for just 10 extra seconds than you normally would. Let me give you an example. If you and your partner are, they come to you and they say, hey, I want to have a conversation about the future. And immediately it's like, boom, all the triggers kind of go up and you feel this drastic urge to pull away. This is where you need to kind of kick in and say, okay, I'm noticing right now that I feel unpleasant. I feel an urge to pull away, but let me try sitting with this urge for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever. Height of an emotion is 90 seconds. So if you can ride it out for 90 seconds, then you will be okay. After a couple seconds, you can turn your attention to something else, whether that's your partner, say a response to them, whether that's the floor, whether that's orienting yourself around the room. But essentially, the more you're able to sit in that uncomfortable emotion and you practice that over and over again, the easier it's going to be to manage, because you're basically retraining your nervous system to do that. Okay. So phase three is past exploration. And just like we did with anxious attachment, we want to basically dive into some of those core wounds and some of those core beliefs that kind of led us to here. And we want to understand what aspects of our past and our relationship with our caregivers got us to this point and develop this type of attachment. So I want to give a disclaimer that this is just education. Okay. This is not a replacement for therapy. And when we do go back in the past, sometimes it can open up some negative and difficult emotions. So please do this at your own pace. And if you find it too overwhelming, please stop and reach out to a mental health professional. Okay. Basically, here, what I've done is create some prompts for you in a variety of categories. We have the emotional availability of your caregivers. Okay. The learned habits that you had from your caregivers about connection and intimacy, the learned independence that you had to kind of go through, various patterns that you may have noticed across your relationships. And then looking a little bit at your inner child, like, what would it really mean to be weak? How did you feel when you were alone? And then some future directions of what you want to give yourself now. So I'm not going to go through all of these because this is something to do on your own time. You want to sit down, you can ask yourself some of these questions. You can write down your answers. You can talk it out loud to yourself. You can, record a voice recording and listen back to it and start understanding and learning more about what is it that has been from your past that's shaping you right now. Phase four is repatterning. So essentially, we want to change the brain. We want to develop new neural networks, and that is neuroplasticity, right? And we're already doing that by understanding what's going on. So we're bringing more awareness to it by allowing ourselves to be a little bit more comfortable with the discomfort. That's training our brain to get used to that. And then once we get the knowledge of our past, we can get to this stage. So what we're going to do is two things. First, we're going to do a core belief exploration. So you're going to go through this core belief or structuring exercise, okay? Basically, the way that this is going to work is you're going to think of a moment that basically triggered withdrawal, discomfort, over intellectualization, or any other avoidant tendency in your recent time. And we want to look at what uncomfortable belief kind of surfaced. Was it maybe I'm unworthy? Emotions make things complicated. It's not safe to open up. You want to take that belief and put it into a category of what it impacts the most. Maybe that's your romantic relationship. Maybe it's it prevents people from getting close. And you can expand of like what it limits in your life, right? What it limits in your connections, what it limits about yourself, and where does it maybe create distance that you are not necessarily consciously choosing, right? This belief may just be creating distance between you and others. And what does it make you miss out on, even if it's not something that you think about or talk about? And most importantly, who does it potentially hurt, right? So you want to go through that belief, through that type of situation, and break it down like this. And once you're able to break down the impact, this is where we're going to link it to the past. So because we did the past exploration, now we can look in and think, where did I feel this way before? And what did the younger version of me learn about all these experiences? When this type of belief or rule was implemented, why was it useful to me and when? Then what we're going to do is challenge the belief. So I'm a big believer that you can choose whether you want to identify it with something or not. So, you can look back and ask yourself some of these questions, such as like, is this belief a fact or is it a fear? If a friend had this belief, what would I tell them? What evidence do I have that maybe challenges this belief? And you're going to go through creating a secure reframe. So when we create a new secure belief, we want it to be something that feels possible, that feels supportive, that feels grounded. So you want to write down the belief that you just challenged. Okay. Let's say the belief is, if I get too close to people, they're going to hurt me. Okay. Let's say right now you believe that at like an 8, okay? When it's most convincing, it's an 8. When it's least convincing, it's a 2. And let's reframe it into something more balanced. So, for example, closeness doesn't have to be all or nothing. Or just because I let people in, it doesn't mean they're going to hurt me. And I love this little chart here because you're going to look for evidence in your life that first does actually make you believe this thing, okay? But then you're going to take that evidence and you're going to reframe it a little bit. Maybe at one point in your life you had someone very close to you and they hurt you, but maybe they just weren't the right person for you, or maybe there was some other contextual factors that you need to consider with that type of hurt. Then we're going to look at the evidence for your reframe belief. So your new belief is, people can be close to me and not hurt me. And maybe your evidence is, oh, I have a lot of friends and like they're close to me and they've never hurt me. So it's very likely that I can also have a partner that won't hurt me either. That's what you're going to look from the past. But then you also want to look to see, what am I going to look for in the future, right? So maybe you're going to start looking at different behaviors of people who are looking to get close to you. And if you notice that they're very honest, they're fair, they're loyal, they're open with you, then you'll take that in as like, okay, I can let them in and I know they're not going to hurt me. I'm going to believe that they're not going to hurt me. From there, you want to choose an aligned action with this belief. Okay, so I gave a lot of different examples here. So for example, here it might be, naming this need for space instead of disappearing. So you may feel a little bit uncomfortable when people get too close and you might disappear. So instead of doing that, next time it happens, you're going to say, hey, I just need a little bit of space to kind of think this through and list what that action will be. And I gave you some more examples here. This is from the Center for Clinical Interventions, and it has a lot of really great examples of how you can actually implement these actions in here. And you can redo this whole practice for every different core belief that you have. Second part of this phase is relational experiment. So you need to practice receiving care in low stake ways. You need to let your partner, take you out, write a letter for you, read the poem that they might have given to you, let them hold your hand, like tiny little things like that. For example, like even just asking them, hey, like, do you want to accompany me on a grocery run? Or, hey, do you think you can maybe, I don't know, like proofread this paper for me? Something so small that lets people in to get yourself feeling more comfortable, being taken care of, and being loved. Okay. Another thing is naming your needs without self judgment. So this can start really small, right? But like, oh, today I'm really craving sushi and I really would like for us to eat that, right? Or hey, like right now, there's a lot on my mind. I just need maybe 5 minutes just on my own. Or I need, this evening to kind of, sit down and relax. Letting yourself name those things and letting the other person hear them, it trains your brain to feel more comfortable with doing so. And the final thing is to repair instead of withdrawing. So let's say you're having a conversation, okay, and you want to leave this conversation. You don't want to be here. There's an uncomfortable situation. Okay, this is where you can come in with that practice of, okay, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to feel the discomfort. And once I feel the discomfort, even if I need to leave for 5 minutes, I'm going to come back and I'm going to repair it. Because I think what happens a lot with avoidance is like, we just feel like, okay, well, if we ignore it, if we avoid it, it will go away. It will not go away. It will 100% backfire in your face eventually. So that will look like coming back to the conversation and having it. Maybe you can't have it right now, but you're going to have it tomorrow or you're going to have it the next day and you're going to create a repair. And when you do that, your brain realizes, hey, I can do this. I can trust myself to manage these things. And that is going to help you so much. And the final phase is through secure autonomy and connection. Here, we really want to work on balancing your independence and intimacy. Okay. So, the first thing that we're going to look at is this secure communication. So, this is something that I developed that can help you when you want to start being more vocal with your partner and expressing more of your needs. So, before you communicate, you're going to check in with yourself. What are you feeling right now? For example, I'm feeling a little bit angry, right? Underneath this feeling is this discomfort of closeness, for example. So, you're going to identify what it is underneath. And then you want to be very specific of the goal of this communication. Are you trying to express a need? Are you trying to repair a moment? Are you trying to maybe feel closer to your partner? And from there, you want to speak very factually about the situation. Okay. Hey, when this happened, or when we went through this, or when this conversation came up, I felt blank because, and then express a very clear and doable need. Okay. So you want to keep it to be factual. You want to make sure that you're sharing what's going on internally, which now you'll have a better idea of because you've been practicing your somatic awareness. And then because you've been practicing expressing your needs, you can go in there and say something, for example, like, I need a little breathing room just for a moment, or I need to know what your intention is, or I need to feel emotionally ready before we can problem solve. And I know this can be difficult to do. So these are some strategies that you can self soothe while you're communicating, such as, breathing in, breathing out, relaxing your shoulders, planting your feet nicely on the floor, giving yourself a little bit of a grounding phase. And after that, you can kind of reflect on what went well and what you can try next time. Okay. And the final thing is to develop secure reliance. So, with all of these behaviors coming together, what it's going to do is going to open the door for more comfortability with intimacy and with letting people in. It's going to be a little bit of an experimentation for you because you're going to start to notice what feels good to you, what feels like you can push a little bit further, and where you can kind of push through that discomfort. But the goal is to be able to securely communicate what you want, to securely feel comfortable that, let's just say, even if you do get hurt, even if something doesn't go your way, even if someone maybe does judge you a little bit for something, right? Because we can't control the behavior of others, that you will be okay and you will be able to manage because you have the tools that even if big emotions come up, you can help yourself regulate them. My outro got deleted like 3 times, so this is my fourth time refilming it, but I really hope that you guys learned something from this lecture, that it resonated with you, that it helped you, and I really hope that you can start practicing these techniques and get to a point where you feel very comfortable with your avoidant attachment and moving and shifting into more of that secure base. Like I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to work with me one-on-one and really get into the depths of your avoidant attachment, then here are some instructions of how you can do that on the screen. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I wish you all the best.